Hi guys, and welcome to this week's episode of Behind the Frame. I hope you enjoyed Marlon's guest episode last week where he looked at a sepia tone adjustment to an image. Very, very interesting, and I hope you didn't miss it, so go and check it out if you did. Today I'm going to be looking at the use of the radial filter, and I've got an image from the Okavango Delta. I'm literally going to be heading up there in exactly a month's time to host our Botswana Wilderness Safari. And this image was taken at one of the camps that we stay at Chitabi Camp, in Chitabi Concession, southern part of the Okavango Delta, just an incredible area for predators, very well known for that. So we spent the first 3 nights of the safari in this area. And this was late afternoon, so if we have a look at some of the information on here, this was at 1,000th of a second, f3.5, ISO 2,500, underexposing by 1 1/3. So what do those values mean? So 1,000th of a second, we've obviously got interaction here. Now these two females, the sun had set, they were starting to get a bit more active as lions do at this time of day. So the shutter speed up at 1,000th of a second to try and freeze the movement. However, low light, so we needed to crank the ISO a little bit, ISO 2,500. Just a little bit more than wide open, so f2.8 to f3.5. We've got multiple subjects here, and so the choice here was less about the depth of field and more about just trying to get as much light through that lens as possible. And so these females were in a kind of pretty much horizontal plane to the vehicle, so that wasn't too much of an issue there, which is quite fortunate. And then obviously underexposing by 1 1/3. If we come back and have a look at the details on this image here, so we've lifted it just a touch, but the camera would have wanted to give us something along these lines. And because it's got a very, very dark background, we're underexposing, and we're also purchasing a bit of extra shutter speed at the same time. From a process point of view, our basic edits just lifted the exposure just a touch, and so someone would say, well, why did you underexpose as much then? Remember, underexposing gives you a faster shutter speed, and that was something that we really wanted in this instance. So I'm quite happy to lift the exposure by just under 1/3 of a stop here in Lightroom and rather benefit from that underexposure and extra shutter speed that we would have purchased in the field at the time. The whites, just lifting those whites a touch, a little bit of clarity across the scene, and saturation. As a standard, I saturate my images to a value of +4. Lifting the lights, so in the tone curve, so remember here we're taking the brightest lights and we're making them brighter, and the darkest lights making them a little bit darker. Not too much needed to be done on the darks and the shadows. If you have a look here at the histogram, because we've underexposed, most of the images sitting on that side, and I'm quite happy with that. On the detail side of things, sharpening to a quite aggressive an amount of 60 on that at 1.4, and masking all the way out to a value of about 80 or so. You can see, remember, only the white areas of this image are what is going to be sharpened at the moment. And so this is perfect. That's really what we're looking for and what we want to be sharpened on this shot. Now, from a cropping perspective, maybe just addressing these little white areas which are on the top of the frame. So I'm just going to bring this in a touch, and you'll see that whilst we've still got the white areas over there, they're not as strong and powerful on the edge of the frame as those original two. So very lucky shooting with a 400mm prime. These guys, or ladies rather, fitted into the scene quite nicely. What I want to show you is, this is a kind of a great image to start off with. Using that shallow depth of field, we've got foreground in here, so it's soft and then it gets progressively sharper and then drops off again. And that's one of the beautiful aspects of shooting with a prime lens in these kind of conditions. But what I want to show you is we're going to start to address 1 or 2 things in this image which we can make even more powerful. So if we go to our radial filter tool, which is up here, and I'm going to double click on the effect just to zero that. Essentially, rather than using a special adjustment brush, which is really for localized areas, when you've got a scene like this and you're wanting to work on a fairly large area, the radial filter is ideal for this. Also, you'll see that I haven't applied a vignette to this image, and that's something that I like to do quite a bit. And the main reason I haven't done it is, if you think about the center of this image, we're looking here. So any vignette that I apply, remember, it works towards the center of the image. Now the subject in this instance is slightly off center. So any vignette that I apply on the outside here is actually going to darken this and then bring us more into the paw and the body. And meanwhile, we're wanting to kind of accentuate this area here. So with our radial filter, what I'm going to suggest we do is I'm going to draw out a shape. Now, drawn a little oval, and I hit O for overlay just to see where we're going to start to apply this effect. Now you'll see we've got a feather slider over here. Obviously, if we don't feather this effect, it's going to leave a hard edge. Please don't ever let me see you do that. And I usually become quite aggressive with this feather value, taking it up to about 75. And remember what I was saying about making your edits a little less obvious, not immediately obvious to the viewer. So what I've done is had a heavy feather value, a very large feather value, so that the effect is bled into the subject. And I'm going to place it just over here, slightly off center. You can see there's a bit of an oval, so we're pulling up to the side. And what you'll notice is that there's still some of whatever effect that we're going to be working on outside of that, and we'll come to that, is still hitting this subject over here and then also on the back side. Now, this is a great update in the newer versions of Lightroom, is that you can use the brush tool and you can go down to erase over here. So now we've got our erase brush. And I'm going to use a value of 3, so a flow of 3, so it'll be a soft kind of adjustment. And I'm just going to go over the face of this lioness, down here onto this lioness's head, onto this paw around the body over here. And you'll see what's happening is that I'm effectively removing some of the areas where the effect is going to be applied. And you'll see that this is going to become a lot more obvious as I brush onto the hindquarters of this lioness over here. So I don't really want to lose the whole background or leave a hard edge, but now you can see that we've removed the effect that we're going to apply to the area that's in red from falling on our subjects. So that's quite nice. A lot easier than trying to come and brush in everything around the outside of this frame. Now I'm going to switch the overlay off. What do we want to apply here? Now this image was taken at an ISO of 2500, so there is a little bit of grain here. If I hold the spacebar down and I zoom in, you'll see that there's a little bit of noise around this section over here. That's in the background and the same in the foreground over here. We've got a noise slider here, and when you take this value all the way up, what it does is it actually smooths out and becomes very, very soft and treats all of that noise. You'll see that if we go the opposite direction, it almost kind of brings grain back into the image. So if you have a look there now, that's quite grainy, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, it softens out and blurs out. So by virtue of the fact that we've used a radial filter to apply this effect outside of our subject, we're treating noise in areas outside and not affecting the sharpness of our subjects at all. So whilst I'm not going to be that aggressive with this noise slider, I am going to reduce the amount of noise and the graininess that takes place outside of the subject. I also want to drop clarity a little bit. And this is something I want to talk about when it comes to these radial filters, is that you'll see depth of field runs across an image. So if we were to think about drawing a circle onto the subject, let's just go and quickly do this again. I'm going to create a new radial filter. I wouldn't be able to just go and apply the effect of zero clarity down like this across the subject. Why? Because it's not natural for this rump, which is sitting in the same focal plane as my subject, to be soft and out of focus. It's not right. Everything that sits at that focal plane should be sharp and in focus. So to do an adjustment like this, if we drop this feather down here, maybe you'll be able to see it, but you'll see that this is now sharp and detailed, and then it gets all of a sudden soft and blurry. But that content is in the same focal plane. Don't do that. If you're going to work across a whole scene like this, widen it out so that you're starting to then at least emulate the same sort of focal plane. So you're not affecting anything on the edges of that. You can't just have a circle around it. The Instagram filters are horrible for this because they've kind of entrenched this in us. We can get these lovely soft backgrounds and all of a sudden you're kind of focused on the subject, but that is not how optics work. So your focal plane, make sure that you're not affecting something that is in your focal plane in a manner which is not natural, if that makes sense. Right, let's take that one away. Coming back to what we're working on now. So with that, we're going to drop clarity a little bit. And this is where I'm going to use kind of apply my vignette. So remember now, we're working on the areas outside of our subjects, areas that are in red. And these areas, if I drop the exposure all the way down, it kind of shows you, it gives you an idea of how the effect is no longer being applied just to the center. We're starting to emulate that effect by adjusting the exposure. So we're obviously not going to be that aggressive. I'm just going to go down by maybe 0.2 of a stop over there. And I think that should do the trick. So now, before we've applied our radial filter, and now with the radial filter. Right, so the only other adjustment that I'd like to make here is just to go in onto the face of this lioness here, just maybe lift that just a touch. So we're going to reduce that, zero our effect, and just on her face, hit O for overlay so I can see what's happening and be a bit more aggressive with the flow on this. So we're just going to work her face, and that should pretty much do the trick. And I've now switched that effect off, and I'm just going to lift this a touch. And we're going to add a little bit of clarity into that. All right, and so for me, that's pretty much where I would like to leave it. So as a before and after, you can see the contrast that we've applied and the kind of radial filter around there, which has been targeted at addressing noise outside of our subjects, and also just dropping that exposure a little bit so we've got that vignette type effect coming through, has made a massive difference. When you look at this image now, you immediately go to your subject, which is this lioness who's busy tackling her sister. Right, short and sweet, but hopefully the radial filter has a place in your toolbox and you now have a better understanding of how to use it. I find that it's a great tool for working larger areas where you don't necessarily want to go in and brush, and you can affect large areas of an image very quickly without leaving hard edges using the radial filter. That's it for this week. We'll see you guys again next week. As always, if you have any questions or would like to see images from our team featured in the Behind the Frame series, do let me know. Cheers.